All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Wednesday, April 13th of 2022. Thank you for tuning into the stream here today. Hope your baseball lineups are off to a good start here today. We've got the somewhat rare, I guess maybe not so rare, fairly common, especially for the Wednesday and Thursday slates. But the main slate is ongoing right now. The main slate is the early slate on today's baseball slate here. So we've got, I think, a 4-gamer coming up here later this afternoon, maybe soon to be a 3-gamer. That Seattle and White Sox game doesn't look too good, but hopefully your lineups are doing okay out there. If you've been with me all week so far, we've been having some technical difficulties on stream here this week. The old central processing unit in my desktop is starting to go. So we're going to do the best we can with it today. The good news is we have some new parts coming in the mail here before the end of the week. So we should be back into the modern era with our computer technology here. Probably by maybe Friday or maybe first thing next week. The parts that are in there have done me well, but they're about 10 years old now here, so getting pretty old. There is one more piece of kind of housekeeping before we dive into questions here. There is, as of today, or as of yesterday morning, a contest selection video up for baseball on our YouTube channel, breaking down what I think are the best contests to play and why. There's a handy little spreadsheet that's plugged in there as well. It's linked in the description of that video. That's on Google Sheets that you're welcome to go download or make a copy of and put in your own drive and use for your contest selection. Pretty cool stuff there. Interested to continue using that throughout the season here. But anyway, let's go ahead. Let's start getting into this and answering some questions here. We'll dive in. So again, we've got day baseball going on. We got some baseball tonight. We got NBA playoffs, all kinds of stuff. Handful of questions in the queue here today, but not a super busy queue of questions in front of us here. So if you've got questions for me, go ahead and fire away. But let's get started here. I think this was actually kind of a relevant question just for today in particular, since we had a lot of weather games. So I wanted to start with this question from T. This had come up in Slack yesterday too as well. And he said, should the sliders be brought back a little if a game has been postponed on a smaller slate, or is it fine to leave it default? Thanks. Yeah, so that's actually just one thing that I think we want to add or improve. That's kind of just on our list. And I think it's a decent way to add some value to the process. It won't make a huge difference, but I do think best practice is to adjust your sliders if a game gets postponed. And I think a basic rule of thumb, very basic rules of thumb here, right, is that as the slate gets smaller, your correlation is probably going to go down a little bit, and your ownership fade and variance will go up, right? The reason correlation comes down is there's less players in the pool at that point. It's more likely that the winning lineup is going to approach the actual mathematical optimal. We don't need to keep track of correlation as much. We need to just kind of get closer to that raw optimal. So if this 4-game night slate becomes a 3-game slate, which I think it might, a very simple way to approach this and deal with this would be to just basically, I would say, probably bring correlation down 1, maybe ownership and variance up 1. I think that's just like a decent way to dial in a little bit more precisely there. That's probably the simplest thing to do. I will say, I don't think it's going to kill you by any means if you build using the original sliders. If you have a little bit more time and want to get a little extra dialed in, one thing I think you can do is actually just go look and figure out what the exact sliders are for a 3-game slate, for example. So we don't have a 3-game slate on today's slate here, but I think we did yesterday. So if you want to go see, what's a 3-game slate supposed to be, just go pick any 3-game slate that we have here. So there was one yesterday, the 720 Turbo. And then we can go see. So if we're playing that 20 max 10 to 50K, we can go see what the sliders are here, and it's 479. So I think that's actually pretty close to where we put it, but not exactly right? So 479, let's compare that. And we're talking about just like a couple notches in either direction. Again, I don't think this is going to be a huge thing a huge difference maker. Yeah. So, okay. So in reality, it basically goes like this. So the ownership fade stays at 7, but this goes down 1 and this goes up 1. So I do think it's a decent idea. I think it probably adds a little bit more value, probably gets you a little bit more closer to what is optimal strategy for that now new slate size. Something we want to automate in the future, but I think for now, a decent thing to spend some time on. And if you don't have time, like if you're in a time crunch and you don't have time to go back into an old slate or something like that to figure out what the sliders are, you can make, I think, some manual adjustments there and be totally fine. So, but cool. Great. Let's keep it going. I wanted to hit this question again as well. This was from Adam. And he about the MLB showdowns. And he said, I recall from Matt or Will a couple weeks ago, there was a mention of improved predictions on bullpen usage. Curious if these updates have made it in yet. Currently still looking usage by hand, but would be easier if the Sims made that easier. Thanks for everything. Yeah. So good opportunity to talk about this. So we have made some improvements to our bullpen model and our like pitching leash model this offseason, heading into the season. There's actually more improvements for that going live, I believe, this week. But what we have not yet implemented is kind of a robust model for which relievers have pitched recently. That will primarily affect showdown. I would say this probably virtually doesn't affect your main slates really at all, or your classic slates at all. But on showdown, I do think it is still wise, as we were doing last season, to double check your relief pitcher exposure and to make sure that those guys haven't pitched like pretty much just the day prior. I would say if a reliever pitches the day prior, probably unlikely that they're going to be used again the following day. And just removing your exposure to those pitchers or just Xing those guys out of your pool in the first place, I think is still a good idea. It is our goal to improve upon that this season, but that particular component has not been implemented yet. So definitely a good thing to bring up here. So, all right, cool. And then wanted to touch on question from Mark here as well. This is a little bit more on the feature request side of things. It looks like he said, is it possible to combine multiple builds into one to be downloaded and entered into DK? For example, 3 single lineups combining and entering into a 3 max contest. No, you can't do that at the moment. That is also something that we want to implement. That's a very common request, especially from people that are just playing a few lineups, building multiple builds, or even if you're building your 150, but also playing single entry and you spot a lineup that for one reason or another stands out to you. And you're like, hey, I really want this to be my single entry lineup. There's not a super easy way to do that at the moment. That is a very common request, though, and that is firmly in the roadmap for us to add at some point. It'll probably that will probably coincide with in some form or the other being able to combine multiple lineup sets. So you can make like 50, you can make 75 and 75 and combine those into a 150 max or something like that. Just a little bit more control over what defines a build versus a lineup set and so on. That's on the roadmap, but not a very easy way to do that right now. The easiest way to do that would probably be to just download those lineups and combine them into the CSV for yourself. But it is something we know that it's a pretty popular request, and it's something that we want to add in the future. So, cool. Okay, and jump over to YouTube here. Aaron said, any thoughts on making a player pool for pitching? I would say if you want to go that route, if you like curating player pools, I would feel way more comfortable if you told me you were doing that for your pitchers than your hitters. I strongly advise against creating like a hitting pool, just because hitting player projections are so close together. You're generally going to be wanting to be stacking anyway, and I think it's more about what teams you're stacking than like individual players. I wouldn't curate a hitting pool. I don't curate player pools in any sport because we're leveraging simulations to build these lineups, right? So when you set your sliders at a particular setting, the primary factor of what players end up in your lineups and what players end up in your lineup pool more broadly is really this sim variance setting, right? It is creating buckets of simulations and then building an optimal lineup for that set of sims. So you are never, the whole reason you would want to build a player pool in the first place, right, on a traditional tool, let's back this up and think about like from what you would be doing on a traditional optimizer. The reason you would curate a player pool is because there would be players that would theoretically project well on average that the builder might use in lineups that don't have upside, right? That's the origination. That's the reason why a player pool would exist, is you would have a player, because if the player was poorly projected, the builder would never use them in the first place. You wouldn't have to worry about that. The main concern here would be a player that was projected well that the builder would want to use that didn't, for one reason or another, have the upside or enough upside to make them profitable to use in your lineups, right? That's the idea here. When we're building lineups with simulations, every player used in any lineup by definition has upside because they were used in the lineup, right? So if you get a player, if you get a particularly lower projected player, which will happen all the time in baseball, it's because for the set of sims that were selected, even for pitchers, right? Let's say you get, our lowest projected pitcher for this 4-game night slate is Berrios right now, right? And let's say you get some Berrios lineups in there, right? Well, it is by definition that he was optimal in that set of simulations used to build the lineups. He had upside in a set of real game play-by-play simulations. So for me, I'm just good. I'm good with it. I got no problems with that. I don't curate a pool for any sport for virtually any position for that reason. Now, with that said, pitchers are still pretty widely distributed in their outcomes, but their outcomes are a little bit more normal than I would say than definitely hitters. I think they're, when you look at a guy like Garrett Cole, his projection is 17.79 points. That's probably right around here. He's got this wide range of outcomes, all of these different things that can happen. This is true of most pitchers, but it is still true that most of his common outcomes are around his average, which makes me feel a little bit more comfortable with curating a pitching pool just because they can at least be a little bit more expected to score reliably. It's still just not my thing personally. And I don't know how much value it adds really because of the way that simulations are pulled in, but I probably wouldn't talk you out of it. But I don't do it. I don't think it adds a ton of value, but I don't think it is negative EV to go ahead and do that. You may just, the biggest thing I think you could potentially miss plays that you didn't see, right? That for one reason or another are good plays. So, but Neil said, I realize this is a pretty broad question, but do you have a benchmark you look to hit for the amount of lineups you want in the top 1%? I feel like looking at the top 1% lineup percentage helps as far as evaluating your process and make sure you're putting in good lineups. Yeah, in general, I think it's a pretty decent tool. It's one of the best tools we have to try to give us a little hint if what we're doing is working beyond just pure profit and loss in the high variance game like this. I think in any slate or any contest type where duplication isn't a huge factor, right? I think it works pretty good. It doesn't pick up on duplication. Right. So like, for example, for NFL Showdown, in a sports contest type where you have a very high risk of being duplicated, you could be placing in the top 1% very often, but being duplicated very often and still be playing in a negative EV way because of how often you're allowing yourself to get duplicated. But in classic slates in general, where there's not a big duplication risk, I think it's fine. Benchmarks, I like to see 1.4% or more. At 1.4%, I start feeling pretty comfortable. I feel pretty confident that I have an edge in the sport. Higher than that is just gravy. I don't know. It is a rough enough calculation on its own that I don't think you can get super scientific with how with how precise to get there. I also think it's a little bit sport dependent. So, like, for example, for NBA, my top 1%. For NBA, so I had a great NBA season. I didn't do much different this year. Historically, baseball has been my best season, but this was my best NBA season of all time. And my top 1% equity was like 2%. But it was flat, right? I had a lot of equity in all of the top high finishing percentiles. In football last year, I had a top 1% equity of 1.8%. And then it just fell off a cliff. I was basically completely flat from there. My top 2% equity was like 1%. And it was basically very flat. I basically made up all of that extra percentage point that I had in the top 1% equity evenly across all of the other percentiles. which was very strange. That I still don't understand exactly why that happened. But there is a little bit of sport dependence there. On higher variance sports, I think it's fair to assume that you may not get as flat of a finishing percentile. And I've dabbled a little bit in like League of Legends so far this year. And strangely, my curve for League of Legends is almost like a U, where I actually outperform my expectation at the very bottom end of percentiles, but also the very top end of percentiles. My League of Legends lineups are underperforming their expectation at like the middle percentiles, which is interesting. But anyway, I think broadly speaking, for me, that 1.3 to 1.4 range of the top 1% equity is where I kind of start to feel like I'm probably at least break even to the rake. I imagine I'm not a net loser in the sport over the long term. And above and beyond that is where kind of the profit starts to come in. So, but yeah, and then just remember that for sports where duplication is a big risk, and League of Legends actually is a good example of that, right? There's like a pretty decent dupe risk in league, most league contests, so it won't pick up well on that. But good question there. Yeah, Neil's right. Football's tough because there are way less slates. Yeah, so one thing I did do this year to try to just help that out is I played every NFL slate, which is actually a lot when you think about it, because there's a lot of slates that kind of mimic the main slate. So you'll have, if I remember correctly, there's like a Thursday to Monday, but then also like a Thursday. I think there's a Thursday to Sunday. There's the early main and afternoon on Sunday. There's a Sunday to Monday. And even though the results of those are all correlated, I think it does still help to smooth out the variance a little bit of studying your results. But yeah, it is definitely still something to think about there. So, cool. Let's see. Tryhard Sweat said, does SaberSim take into account K rates, ISO splits, weather, XWOBA and WXWOBA, batted ball distance, and things like that? I can't speak to individual like advanced stats or splits. This isn't going to be the most helpful answer, and maybe one of the models guys, if they're watching, can help chime in. But we are taking into account these advanced statistics in the form of whatever is predictive in terms of assessing the probability of different events happening in a given at-bat are taken into account in the simulations. But it's because we're simulating games, it's a different way of really thinking about this than just like average projections. Average projections are going to use some kind of baseline, like Vegas as some kind of baseline, and kind of start things there, and then apply in these other factors as just adjustments to the average projection. So we say this pitcher is this generic person, and this hitter is this generic person. And now we start to factor in this and this and this and this and have the average projection, right? With SaberSim, we kind of start from a more fundamental level and then simulate out all of these different outcomes. So we take into account these things in effect, and particularly, I guess the one thing I should say, weather is explicitly accounted for here in the simulations, right? We simulate the game in the actual weather conditions that the game is going to be played in. But it is not as if we simulate the game and then say, okay, now let's add in the ISO splits or whatever, right? Because that is a descriptive statistic of a player. So we have an understanding of how much power that a hitter has based on their historical data. And I imagine that, some of the more predictive data points of advanced statistics are incorporated into this model here, but it is not done after. A lot of times when you hear people talk about their projection models or their different models for different sports, they will say, oh, it takes this thing into account. And what they really mean is that as a multiplier or a factor or some kind of thing that's used at the end of the projecting process, right? So ultimately, that which we have found is predictive. Oh, phone's ringing. Is included into our in our model, but I would be interested. Maybe one of our models guys is listening along here and has something to add in about these in particular. But so, Ryan says thoughts on the edge in the truck / Xfinity races using the Sims. I think there's a huge edge to be gained in NASCAR, right? In general, I would say that it might be a little bit smaller in trucks and Xfinity because the contests are smaller. You're going to have sharper competition in those contests, period. Right. The main Cup Series events have huge contests. And I think they're actually pretty soft. I think they're pretty beatable. I think there's still a big edge in the trucks and Xfinity. I've been playing them every single week, but I think it's fair to assume that your ROI is probably going to be lower there just because the competition is sharper. They're going to build better lineups. But the big edge in NASCAR, period, is in the lineup construction, right? That there is a theoretical. Let's actually, do we have any? I wonder if we probably don't have NASCAR projections up for this week yet, right? Because we don't have starting positions. Yeah, there's like opportunity cost to certain outcomes, right? Like like a lot of times, in a kind of dominator race, you can't have two of these guys racking up all the points, right? It's more likely that you're going to have one of these guys that's basically pole sitting throughout the entire race and taking up that particular position and those points that come into play there. So you have this lineup construction edge where average projections don't really alone give you an idea of what actual optimal lineups would look like for a race. And I think that still persists significantly even in the trucks and Xfinity races. So yeah, I would recommend playing them. But Neil said, so I always play the main slates mostly because I don't have time to spread out so much, but I have to imagine those Thursday to Monday slates are pretty good considering the late swap advantages. Yeah, a lot of people just forget about them. At least that's how it appears. Two things. I think there's two kind of weird edges that show up with Thursday to Monday, and I didn't expect to be talking about Thursday to Monday NFL slates here on today's show, but that's fun. It feels fresh. Feels like it's been a while since we've talked football. The two edges that you kind of get from those, one, people just don't late swap. They don't bother to reset anything, especially for football, man. It's like a different level of softness in terms of the field you're playing against. Like, it really is. But you get a lot of people that don't late swap. And then also a lot of people play those Thursday or Mondays to specifically play players in the Thursday game. So the Thursday game is often just over-owned anyway. Like, the ownership, people play that contest because they want to play DFS and they like want to play, it's like a Cowboys Eagles game on Thursday night, and Zeke will be like 30% owned. So, but okay. Aaron said, one more question. Only in Stacks group. Is it on the table as a feature? Something, yeah. It's also somewhat commonly requested. It maybe. I get it. It is just a little. It's a little bit opposed to what we're trying to do. Like we want people to have the goals. We want people to have the controls to make the lineups exactly the way they want. But using simulations to build lineups, part of like the fundamental advantage of what you get out of that is avoiding having to go in and babysit your player pool in that way to mark individual players as only using stack or not using stack, right? That kind of thing, right? That in theory, when you are using accurate simulations and leveraging those simulations to build lineups, players that you are getting as one-offs are optimal as one-offs for that set of lineups. Players that are only used in stacks are only optimal when stacked, only makes sense when leveraging the correlation. That should be automated. In theory. I could see us still adding this just so there's another layer of control if you want it there. It's not something that I would expect immediately. But Yeah, I kind of see both sides of this. I think like the core argument here is that you shouldn't have to do that using SaberSim, but I understand what the extra layer of control gives you if you can do it here. So, Dante said, Jordan, why am I getting so many game stacks in my top MLB lineups? Yeah, this question has kind of strangely been coming in quite a bit throughout this week, and I actually did a little bit of digging just to make sure everything was kind of good on our end about the way that we were handling game stacks. The two opposing team batters playing each other typically, let's pull one of these up, are not really going to have very much of strong correlations. There's like this like very slight positive correlation between opposing team batters. Most of the time, they're generally can be thought of as pretty uncorrelated. And if you are getting game stacks of batters together, it's kind of just like the fact that in that set of simulations, both team stacks independently had a good hitting performance. It's important to remember too that for things like park factors and weather, those are shared between both teams playing in the game, right? So if you have a situation where there is a game that stands to be a really good hitting environment for one reason or the other, that's going to benefit both teams. This game, for example, right? Cincinnati is a good hitter's park. It is, of all of the games that are on the slate here, this is what we projected to be the highest overall average performing hitting team and the tied for fourth. So it makes sense that you may have seen some game stacks of this particular game, for example. There's also games, players can be an entire game can be relatively underpriced, and then you may get game stacks of that game. So I would not worry too much about your game stacks for baseball. I actually wouldn't worry about them at all. I don't think it's worth targeting them because those correlations are not high enough to target them. I also don't think it's worth avoiding them because there's no reason to think that those two stacks are negatively correlated. They are not going to, the one team going off is not going to affect the ability of the other team to go off on the hitting side. So, Guy Will Gamble summarized that actually in a much more concise way than I did. So, Rogue, I think I missed your question somewhere else, so I saw this. Weather impacts a player's projection via the Sims, but does SaberSim adjust your exposure to games with bad forecasts, or do you need to do it yourself? It's a good question. So at the moment, we don't do any predicting of postponement or delays or in-game delays or any of that kind of weather risk. So that is a value add that you should do, and I would argue if you're going to be successful in baseball that you must do. So if you played this main slate today here, and off the top of your head you couldn't point to me to the games that had weather risk here, I would probably say you need to start incorporating some weather research into your process. So both the Cincinnati game and the game played in Detroit had kind of some weather risk here. It looks like both games are playing safely now, but they did have some weather risk. The resource I like to use is the Roto Grinders Weather Dashboard by Kevin Roth. I'll do a little bit of other research, but I like to always kind of come in here and take a look and see how he is projecting the games here. I think it is in general best practice absolutely you want to fade games that have red. So if I was playing, I'm not playing this night slate tonight, but if I were, I would cross this game off for sure. We'll see how things develop throughout the day, but as it were right now, if lock was happening now, I'd cross this off. And I was off this game earlier today and then got onto it once he downgraded the risk here. Kevin Roth did, but we are not factoring in postponement risk into the way that we are simulating out games. We assume every game plays. So another option is that you don't even have to fade the game, but you can limit your exposure to the game, right? This is clearly, SaberSim liked this game. This is a well-projected game. It did not want to fade these guys. So I think you could also handle that by adjusting exposure and going from there. But test, I got you here. I realize that I missed your question from above here. So here's what I'll do. I'm going to back up real quick and go ahead and make sure I didn't miss any other questions here. So we'll start with Tease, who I apparently missed here. Is there a way to limit the number of batters facing an opposing pitcher on a small slate? There's not. It's not, you are not very likely to get many of these very often. You're even on the 3-game or the 2-game slates, right? So like we can do a 2-game slate here. It just doesn't happen that often. So you'll see this toggle comes on, allow batters versus opposing pitcher, but there's a couple different things happening here. First of all, we're still leveraging simulations, and in this case, we're using a very small number of simulations for each game, right? So if you get San Francisco batters against San Diego pitcher, right, for example, it's going to probably be very small sets of those batters, probably just like maybe the guy that hit the home run. But there's still a correlative factor here. So it's like still counting out the strong negative correlations that a pitcher has to the opposing batter. So for you to even get the exposure to these guys at all, they have to have like an extreme outlier performance to overweight and outweigh that negative correlation that they have to the opposing starting team pitcher. I wouldn't worry too much about that. There isn't a way to directly set that control, but I think it's unlikely that you have a lineup even on a 2-game slate where that's a significant problem. I apologize about missing your comment yesterday. If you can remind me of what it was, I'd be happy to answer it now. I know kind of a busy stream yesterday, so but okay, cool. So Dante, kind of similar question here, right? Also, is it viable to remove 9-hole hitters on the home team, seeing as they typically get less plate appearances? So I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but I really want to emphasize this point. I don't want to beat a dead horse, and I also don't want to come across and just say like, oh, simulations, all your problems are solved. But they kind of are, right? The fact that the 9-hole hitter hits at the bottom of the order and has a less likely chance of getting more plate appearances on average is already, by definition, factored into the simulations because we simulate the games out batter by batter and play by play. So if you are getting stacks with 8, 7, 8, 9-hole hitters in them, that is essentially saying that in spite of the fact that they get less plate appearances, they are still optimal in that lineup. They were optimal for that set of simulations. So like this kind of thing is very much one of those things that you might want to consider doing if you were using a traditional optimizer, optimizing for average projections, because the average projections don't know this. They don't have an understanding of the actual way that the baseball game gets played out. It's just a single descriptive number of an entire range of outcomes, right? So I guess the one thing that you can do here is if you want to set specific stacking rules, you can come in here and limit what batting order positions are allowed in the stacks. So if you want to say, I want to build 5 stacks and I don't want 7, 8, 9, you can do that. That exists here. You can also remove, if you want to just remove 7, 8, 9 hitters from your pool, or even just 9-hole hitters from your pool, you can uncheck these guys in step 1. I would argue that you don't need to do it because, again, since every lineup rests upon a set of simulations or a single game simulation, depending on how high your sim variant slider is set, the players that you are getting, the whatever batting order there is already essentially factored in. We know what batting order position they are in. But with that said, if you want to remove them, or even just for the home teams or whatever you want to do, you can remove them in step 1 and just X them from your pool. You can also set a specific stacking rule and say, don't give me 9-hole hitters in my stacks or something like that. But I think it's going to be kind of EV neutral to do that because you will only, as it is, you'll only get them in your lineups at the rate at which they are optimal for your sims. So Tryhard said, what other value can I add to the process? Being new, all I do is change the Vegas lines. Adding on to my previous question, from what I learned, I don't see where I can add additional value. I will say there are a few good opportunities to make adjustments. SaberSim is automating far more for you than a traditional optimizer does. To take a traditional optimizer and start with average projections and end up with GPP lineups built for upside, you have to do a lot of stuff. You have to set a lot of rules. You have to account for correlation. You have to account for ownership. You have to account for variance. Those kinds of things are essentially already automated for you in the SaberSim process. A couple things I think that are really good opportunities to add value right from the start. These are things that I think are just, you have to do these to be successful, is a few of these things that SaberSim can't do for you. One is tracking weather. You should be looking into the weather situation every day and making a decision. You should be making a conscious decision about how you are approaching games with weather. Different people will have different risk tolerances for how much weather games they are willing to tolerate, but that should be something that you are consciously researching and making a decision on for each game on the slate. The second thing that you should be looking at is late swaps, right? So, for example, we had a situation today where Baez got scratched late and Kirilloff for the Twins got late scratched, right? SaberSim makes it very easy to late swap these players out using the quick swap tools, right? Let me go ahead and pull my lineups in since this slate is going on here. You can use the quick swap and late swap tools to rebuild these lineups. And it automates that and makes that very easy for you. But SaberSim can't just initiate that swap for you on its own. So paying attention to the news, both from weather and for scratches and things like that, is a must do. And it definitely adds some value to the process. From there, I'll kind of go 2 steps deeper here. The first step deeper is that we are going to build you a pool of lineups and give you exposures to different players here that is appropriate for the contest that you are playing, right? And the way that we feel it is appropriate for the contest that you're playing is basically how high this sim variance slider is. The higher this slider is, the more diversified your lineups will be, the less exposure you'll get, the more volatile your lineups will be overall. But it is kind of somewhat of a generalization. It's what we feel is on average appropriate for the way to target that contest. And especially in a sport like baseball, where the most common outcomes for any hitter on the slate is 0, right? It is a good idea, I think, to check on your exposures in step 3 and make sure they're in line with your own personal risk tolerance. There are going to be players out there that want to lock a stack and play 20 lineups or maybe even 150 all with one stack, right? I probably wouldn't recommend that, but I know that there are players out there that want to do that. I am a very risk-averse player when it comes to baseball, and I typically scale down my exposures that I'm getting in step 3 from what SaberSim is giving me by default. So let's go look at this random build here, right? And see what we get out of this, and we'll make some adjustments here. But even for a hypothetical 20 max on, what was this? This was functionally a 6-game slate. I would probably want to bring down my exposure here. And that's just me, right? Yeah, so good example here. I'm probably not comfortable with playing this much of any one hitter on a 6-game slate, even in 20 lineups. And SaberSim saying this is about appropriate exposure for a 20 max, but it isn't for me. So I think adjusting your exposures down in step 3 until they match your own personal risk tolerance is a great idea. That's something I think is a very good introductory way to start adding value and making you more satisfied with your lineups with SaberSim. The next kind of step, right, I think has kind of 2 ways to think about it. And I guess the first way to think about this here is that we put a lot of stock into our models for both the simulations themselves and ownership, but no model is perfect. And there are definitely ways to add value here and make adjustments to both the projections and your ownership based on your own research. Now, this is, I think, probably more of an advanced direction to go in. But I think at some basic level, checking what Vegas totals have for the games and looking for outliers or potentially other situations of games to look into, I think is a great approach. I know this comment says that you're adjusting your team totals to the Vegas lines. I don't think that's necessarily wrong. I think most of the time you're probably going to find that we're pretty close to Vegas. Looking for situations where I would say one thing that I like to do is I like to look at situations where our projection for a team total is a half run or greater off from Vegas, and then treat that as an opportunity to do a little bit of additional research and just make sure that I I want to play that team in that way. Sometimes I bring SaberSim's team total a little bit closer to Vegas. Other times I'll let it go. But I think doing a little bit of a research into a second opinion, into a second model to see where things kind of sit, I think is a good opportunity. I really do recommend, if you're going to make adjustments to projections, doing it via the team totals. For example, maybe I think Vegas was a little bit more bullish on the Braves here today, which decent example actually, because last time I checked, the Braves weren't doing anything, but I think their team total was closer to like 5-5. But one thing that's cool about that, if you do make this adjustment, is that it will make a correlated adjustment over the course of the entire game. So it will adjust the Braves batters. It will also lower the Washington pitcher, right? It will make adjustments throughout the entire game. So I do think that can be a pretty cool way to make adjustments there, as opposed to doing every player individually. I also think making adjustments to the ownership projections is a great idea. So if you disagree on the ownership projections, maybe based on your research that you did into the Vegas totals or something like that, I think it'd be another good opportunity to make adjustments there. Finally, the last way I think you can add value to the SaberSim process is SaberSim, when it builds lineups for you, is going to take into account these three different... Well, okay. So I want to actually differentiate these two, first of all. So what I've just described here would be kind of a disagreement with the inputs, right? You're looking at the way the slate is projected as the whole and saying, no, I disagree on this particular team or this particular game, right? From there, though, right, we are going to basically take the inputs and use the optimal set of build settings that we feel is appropriate for that slate and contest. But then SaberSim is going to kind of arrive at, I would say, basically a decision or a direction of how to tackle the slate. You may have a particular low-owned stack that's showing up in a lot of your lineups. In this case, right, looks like Detroit, Boston, and the Mets, right, are kind of our three. So that's stacking directly against NOLA and then stacking two of the teams in the lowest total game on the slate, right? A fairly contrarian approach. On the stacks, it looks like we're getting mostly 5-3s, 5-2s, 4-4s, 4-3s, but also kind of a 3-3-2, a little bit of stack diversity here. And this is basically saying, considering the inputs as they are and the optimal strategy that the sliders say is the way to play this slate, this is the angle that we're going at for these 20 lineups. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the angle that you take on the slate, right? This is a way to get different and to find a little bit of leverage over the field in your particular lineups. So one of the things that I do, and I've mentioned this a bunch of times, right, is I often like to run research builds in baseball. And a research build is this. It is a 0-0-10 build. It is correlation and ownership agnostic, sim variance 10, and then I'll typically turn min salary to 0 and build 1,500 lineups. And what this does is this builds the optimal lineup for 1,500 random slate simulations, single game simulation of every game on the slate, build the optimal lineup, move on to the next one, do that 1,500 times. And part of the reason I like to do this is because it is a ownership and correlation agnostic build that will kind of show me what the raw percent chance of different players being optimal is. And then from there, I can kind of look at the slate and do my own individual research and figure out, I probably agree with the SaberSim model and the inputs of what the best teams are to play, but I might come to a different conclusion about the best way to leverage that against the field, right? So I like to do these research builds because, if I'm in a pinch and I don't have any time, I'll just run the build and take it as it is. And I'll say, great, Tigers, Red Sox, and Mets stacks today, we're leveraging against NOLA and we're stacking a low total game. We're getting different. I'm in. But if I have more time to research and I have more time to spend, I like to start here from a research build and see, what are the best plays on the slate without thinking about ownership? What are just the overall most likely teams to go off? And I might come to a different conclusion about the teams that I want to be heavy on than what SaberSim has me do, right? So let's see. Let's look at hitting exposure exactly. So I actually here ended up on this early game. I think, hold on. Let me look at this. I want to check something here real quick. Okay. So I ended up actually playing somewhat chalky today. I'm realizing now. I didn't have as much time for my full process, but I might, for example, come to the conclusion, if I had kind of done this here from scratch, maybe I wanted to be on, I don't know. I actually kind of like the conclusion that we got here, right? The highest negative leverage pitcher in the research build is Eovaldi, and maybe stacking Detroit Tigers actually looks kind of good from that direction. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is a lot of times when I have additional time, I like to run these research builds, seeing how the slate looks from kind of a more pure level, and make my own decisions on how I want to leverage that. So overall, hopefully the way I wanted to describe this was kind of a step-by-step guide of how to add value in increasing levels of complexity and increasing levels of advanced strategy, right? I can tell you in very simple terms that you need to pay attention to the weather, you need to pay attention to late scratches, and when those situations come up, I can kind of basically tell you exactly what to do, right? Or exactly how I would handle that. Right. And then increasing in complexity, we get to managing your risk with exposures, right? I can tell you how to do that, but I can't necessarily say for every individual person how much you should reduce your exposure to manage your own risk. That's kind of a personal question of how much exposure are you comfortable having to a batter? For me, it's a red flag anytime I'm more than like 30%, 30 to maybe 40% exposed to a batter, right? That's my personal risk tolerance, the way I approach baseball DFS. From there, we can jump to making adjustments to the projections and the ownership themselves, right? The models are a very good baseline on their own. They are very sophisticated models for simulating baseball and projecting ownership in baseball DFS contests, but they are not perfect. You can absolutely add value. How you would go about adding value? Well, one way I like to do that is to look at Vegas as a second opinion, a strong second opinion, and make some adjustments there. That's not the only way to do that, and there's probably even better ways to do it than what I do. But that's kind of a more advanced strategy that's increasing complexity. I can't give you the exact answer of how to go about doing that. Then finally, another thing, you can take the inputs as they are or with adjustments, but then come to a different conclusion about the best way to leverage that information. SaberSim, when we ran a build, said stack against NOLA, right? And stack up the Detroit and Boston games. And I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? These are, plays that the pitchers on these games are kind of negative leverage here. They are showing up optimal less often than they are owned. And the hitters, well, actually, here's a good example, right? Maybe I would have said I want to play twin stacks a little bit more because that's the highest leverage hitting team, right? So you can come to a different conclusion from the way that you want to approach these particular situations from there. So hopefully that was kind of helpful. I think the last point I want to make on this before I move on is to remember that you have the opportunity to think about these kinds of things with SaberSim because of how much is being automated, right? The amount of time you have to spend researching and deciding how do you want to tackle a slate, where do you want to find your own individual leverage is way smaller with a traditional optimizer because you have to spend all the time setting the stacking rules, setting the ownership caps, setting all this other stuff, which is basically just like the table stakes of the game. You have to stack in baseball to be successful, right? At least to some capacity. You have to take into account correlation. So why not automate that? That's basically what SaberSim does to unlock you to spend your time thinking about higher value things, or if you don't have time to do that, to move on. So remember that you are starting from a further point ahead. I think a lot of times people join SaberSim and they're like, oh crap, what do I do now? Like all the things I used to do when I was building with Fantasy Cruncher or all these different things or whatever, now I don't do them. Well, it's not because they're just gone. It's because SaberSim is helping to facilitate that. It's doing that better and it's automating that for you to unlock you to move on and work on other things like managing your risk, like studying the projections and looking into the projections and ownership at a little closer, or to doing a little bit of your own research and figuring out how you want to tackle the slate. And if you don't have time to do those things, or you don't have the skill set to do those things right now, you can use SaberSim in a more fundamental way and still have a lot of success. So Um, anyway, HC said, I want to try these research builds. What's a good number to run with the 20 build plan? Honestly, the research builds thing, I think is kind of specific to the advanced plan. And I think it's an advanced strategy. It's not something that I think is the core part of the pipeline for every SaberSim user. I've had this question get asked before, like, how can I best do a research with the start plan? And I don't know if there's a really good way to do it in the way that I'm doing it here. If you want to kind of experiment with some of the same concepts in terms of what I try to do with the research build, right? I would start your build, right? So build your actual lineups, right? Like go in here, build your 20 for the contest that you're actually playing with the default settings for your contest. So go in, build this lineup, and look at the direction, look at the players and the teams that you are getting the most exposure to, and compare them to something like Vegas, and try to see if you can kind of piece together why you are getting those teams. And if you can get an understanding of, why on a 20 max build on a 6-game slate with the ownership fade at 5, like what is it about, like why am I getting the lower projected owned teams on the slate, right? Why did I get Boston and Detroit stacks as 2 of the lowest total teams on the slate? Well, it's because ownership fade is high. It's kind of an ownership leverage play, right? And then you can kind of compare, and actually not only that is it an ownership leverage play, but it is a ownership leverage play on 2 teams that SaberSim is higher on than Vegas, right? We're actually about even with Boston, but we're about a quarter of a run higher on the Tigers than Vegas, right? And I think if you start to understand kind of the decisions that SaberSim is kind of arriving at, the decisions that SaberSim is making when leveraging ownership, I think you can kind of start to piece together maybe how you might want to approach that differently, right? Maybe a team that jumped out to you here. I don't know. Let me see here. Okay, here's one. I think the Twins were kind of interesting here, right? Not even running a build, but I do think the Twins were kind of interesting here. We did see when we actually ran the research build that Twins batters were some of the most positive leverage batters showing up in the research build. But it's also like the biggest delta, the biggest change between SaberSim's team total projection and Vegas, right? Like we're clearly picking up something here. And maybe that is a bearish stance on Kershaw, right? Maybe that is a statement about the overall hitting environment of the game. It could be a variety of things, but we clearly like the Twins a little bit more than Vegas does. And you don't have to run a research build to see that, right? You can just compare these totals here. And maybe that would have been a good team to get on, right? Especially, for a larger field kind of thing, right? So anyway, I guess the short answer here is I don't think that's a very good corollary to the research builds for the starter plan, because you need like 1,500 lineups and you need to be able to look at all 1,500 to really get creative with that. But I don't know. I instead would think about what are the concepts of the research build. The goal of the research build is to compare probability of success to ownership projection. And you can kind of still do that with just your own research of looking at the team totals here. I'm kind of curious if there's any other teams that stood out. I do think, one that stands out immediately is we clearly were pretty under on Brave stacks, right? I think that's a very obvious one to start. Let's see, flipping back and forth quickly here. I think, and actually kind of just over on this game in general. So I think those were kind of your directions. Actually, no, really on the Guardians in particular. So we were over on Twins and Guardians, and maybe to a lesser extent this game overall as a whole, and under on Braves, and I don't know. Really just especially the Braves. So they gives you a couple different edges there. So, and this is, again, I think it's just kind of a good opportunity to say, this is kind of the decisions that that SaberSim is kind of trying to help facilitate, right? That's what the ownership fade slider does. It says, here are all the different outcomes that took place in this set of sims. Let's incorporate ownership into that and then make a decision on what the best lineup is to build. But there's a ton of in baseball. Your pool of lineups in step 3 is so diverse. Like let's just go look at it here. Let's go back to the first build we ran, right? This was for a 20 max. First build we ran on the stream here. This is partially what I'm looking forward to speeding up here. I can hear that CPU humming again in the background, right? But let's look at our stack diversity here for this 20 max build, right? So let's see. Team stacks, right? Virtually every team on the slate was stackable in the first just 500 lineups, right? So yeah, SaberSim kind of came to the general conclusion that the best 20 were a lot of Boston, Detroit, and Mets stacks. But, even the Dodgers, right? Chalkiest team probably on the slate. Still perfectly optimal in 27% of your lineups of your 500. So you could have, your conclusion that you could have came to is I want to play some Dodger stacks, right? So Neil said, I feel better about jamming twin stacks at now. Jordan Kershaw throwing a 6 perfect innings so far. Yeah, I think that made perfect sense. I have no problem with that. I think that is pretty clear step to, seeing that in the app, right? We're over them by a half run. So, HC said, also I ran a build and had a 3-man stack with a bunch of one-offs. Is that something you would consider playing? Thanks. Probably not. I think you can get a couple, like you may find in your entire pool of lineups that you might maybe occasionally have some very low saber score lineups that have like a naked 3-man stack or something like that, but it won't, those kinds of lineups shouldn't really show up that often. If you are getting a lot of those kinds of lineups, I would double check your correlation slider and make sure that's pumped up. Right? Like your correlation on most baseball slates is going to be pretty high up here, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I think you shouldn't get many lineups that are that lightly stacked on a typical slate with the correlation that high. So I double check on that. Rogue 3 said, after getting your exposures and stacks and projections all set and your pools finalized, how often do you go through and cherry pick lineups out of the pool? It's not my strategy all too often. Most of the time, since I'm playing like probably about 150 lineups, I find it much easier to just edit my exposures and trust that my saber score is helping to kind of make the final decisions of what lineups I actually want to take with me into the contests. So I don't do a lot of cherry picking of my own lineups personally. That said, if you are playing just a few lineups or playing just a handful of lineups, I think going through and checking and individually picking out what lineups you want to actually play is a great idea. I think that's great. Oh, so Rogue said I meant delete from the pool. I also don't do a lot of that. So I will handle things mostly from a standpoint of exposure, right? I am not one to spot check every individual lineup and decide if I want to play it. Now, I don't think that's a bad idea necessarily either. If you want to do that, if you have time to do that, and want to do that, I think that's actually a decent idea. For me, it's just far easier to just work with the exposures directly and to just trust that the lineups are following behind that. But I don't hate that idea if you have time, and especially if you're playing 20 or less lineups, I think that's realistic to do. So I personally am not that. I'm just not that opinionated about the individual constructions when you get to that point. But I know Max for NFL season, for Showdown in particular, has mentioned that he does a lot of that because he kind of has kind of an intuitive sense of like what the construction implies about a game, right? What does the lineup where you have, I don't know, 2 running backs and a defense and a kicker in there imply about that game state? And do you want to tackle that particular game script in this lineup? That kind of thing. And he does a lot of spot checking of those lineups and unchecking them from the pool. So yeah, no, I think that can be a good way to add value. it is not something that's like kind of in my toolbox. But I like the idea a lot. So, okay. Let me go ahead here. And look, so a couple questions I missed in Slack. So I see 2 questions in Slack. We'll hit these and then we'll start to wrap up on today's stream. T, if you're still here, I never heard back from you. I apologize. I missed your question from yesterday. I'd be happy to answer it now here before the end of the stream. But let's see. This was from Lionheart. He said, I'm curious about pitcher exposures I got in yesterday's build with regards to Elder. Priced at the min 4K and had him projected for 12 points, and the best point per dollar on the slate initial build gave me less than 10%, and attempts to force him above 30 led to constraints. Has it become because the sim doesn't like 4K pitchers, as historically 4K pitchers are not good? What it probably is, and I am, it's difficult for me to just go in and kind of explain a build, but I think it is most likely an upside thing. I'd be curious what his raw scoring upside actually kind of looked like. Is this on this slate? Yeah. Okay. So it is a good example. Let me see here. He has decent upside. I don't know. It's difficult for me to say exactly why you wouldn't have gotten exposure to him overall in your lineups. I think in general, I would find with cheaper pitchers, it is hard for them, even if they project very well on average for a point per dollar standpoint. A lot of times they don't have as much raw scoring upside as other pitchers in the same range. It is also possible that, combined with he doesn't look to be very high owned, but I think one thing that can come up is if the player is particularly higher owned than his other players in a similar range or scoring output in that set of sims, you'll get less exposure to them. This is like the kind of play that a traditional optimizer would play a ton of, because at point per dollar value, right? He'll just get thrown into a bunch of lineups because he scores well on average. You got to remember with the way that SaberSim's building lineups, he essentially has to be the most efficient pitcher to use in the set of simulations that are building that lineup. Like he has to beat out all but one other pitcher in that particular set of sims. So, and I think this is a good thing, but you'll find in general that a lot of times these like lower salary cheap guys, you don't get as much exposure to because they don't have as much necessarily raw scoring upside. I mean, these percentiles actually look pretty decent. And like decent strikeout upside here as well for him, at least compared to his price for 4K. I think that's pretty good. I think, again, difficult for me to go back and say and explain away why you weren't getting exposure to a player. If you want more exposure to a player that you're getting or you're not getting, and finding that even after adjusting it in step 3 that you're running into issues, I think that is a very good opportunity to just bump up the player projection. I like to start when I'm doing player projection bumps. I like to start actually, really what I would probably do if I wanted more of a pitcher is I would probably drop the projection of the team he was facing down by about a half run first and see what the impact of that is on the projections, and then run another build and see if you can get more exposure to him that way. I think that's probably the best advice there. Where did he go? Oh, that didn't do anything. I think it's, anyway, that's what I would do. I think it's because I had a custom projection in for him anyway, but. Okay, and then a question from Edward here. Oops. And we'll make this our last question of the day here. This says, MLB Showdown question. I noticed that I was going to play the afternoon showdown between San Diego and San Francisco and did a beginning build to see that the builder would give me, let's see. Builder gave me 20 lineups. Neither of the starting pitchers were included within the 20 lineups for the captain spot, even though the starting pitcher had the highest projection for the respective teams. Is there some overall logic for this being the case? Hope the question makes sense. Yeah, so again, right, despite the fact that the starting pitchers are the highest average projected players on the slate, right? So you can see here, I know this is yesterday's slate, but it'll work fine, right? For them to be used in the captain spot in the lineups, they have to outscore every other player in the game, essentially, right? They have to be the optimal captain player for that individual game sim. And that's actually going to happen far less than their actual projection would imply. Their average projection would imply, right? On a traditional optimizer, building an MLB showdown lineup is very hard because you have to kind of come up with just average projections, how often certain players are the optimal player to use in that lineup position. With SaberSim, what you'll get, and again, on Baseball Showdown for now, I do recommend, I think we adjusted these. Oh, no, we haven't adjusted these yet. I like the 0010 sliders more. That's what I would recommend using for now. Here, right? This is basically going to give you a single simulation optimal as every single individual lineup. So if you are getting limited exposure to starting pitchers in your showdown lineups, that is basically saying that those pitchers are not showing up optimal as the optimal captain in simulations frequently enough to use them in your lineups. If you disagree, that's perfectly fine. I think you can go about it kind of the same way we just discussed on the previous question. Start by bumping up their min exposure here in step 3 to get more exposure to those guys if you want a little bit more exposure in the captain spots. And if you're still not getting enough exposure to these guys in the captain spots, so we're getting a little bit of exposure here. But if you're still not getting enough and you want more, bump up their projections in step 1 and start with another build. But I think what's really cool and powerful about SaberSim as it relates to Showdown in particular, the game of Showdown, boiled down in a nutshell for DFS, is to come up with game scripts for the way that the game plays out. Create the optimal lineup for those particular game scripts. And then from there, determine what game scripts can be targeted that are the most profitable, mostly by avoiding duplication. And that is essentially exactly what SaberSim was designed to do, right? We take individual single game simulations and build the optimal lineup for that set of sims. So, but, yeah, one thing I would say with this particular question in general is, Edward, I would adjust your sliders and use the 0010 sliders for Showdown. I think the default values as they're currently set up is overvaluing ownership fade far too much for Showdown, and that may be why you are getting like no exposure to the starting pitchers. Fading the starting pitchers might be an interesting idea from a duplication standpoint, but I think ownership fade of 3 is way too high for Showdowns personally. I think it's creating some kind of weird results at the moment. So that's just my take. I haven't played a ton of MLB Showdown this season so far, but when I have, I've been adjusting my sliders to 0010. So, all right, cool. We'll go ahead and leave it there for today's stream. Good luck on the rest of the slate for those of you playing the early. Good luck in your NBA and night slate baseball contests tonight. We will be right back here again tomorrow, same time, 2 p.m. Eastern. So until then, take care. See you guys tomorrow. See ya.